Now, in 1929, as you could probably guess, there was the Great Depression that hit Australia, and it continued for a whole decade until World War II broke out in 1939. The next year, Prime Minister Robert Menzies introduced conscription, and between 1940 and 1941, Australians fought in the Mediterranean theater, participating in Operation Compass, the Siege of Tobruk, the Balkans Campaign, the Battle of Crete, the Syria-Lebanon Campaign, and the Second Battle of El Alamein. On December 8, 1941, Japan joined World War II and immediately attacked Singapore, which surprisingly surrendered on February 15, 1942, after less than 2 months of resistance. 4 days later, Darwin was bombed, making it the first time Australia was ever attacked. Which is kind of surprising, actually, if you think about how many wars they participated in. Anyways, Australia sent 3 forces then to prevent an attack on Australia, with one on Timor, one on Ambon, which was defeated during the Battle of Ambon, and one on New Britain, which was defeated during the Battle of Rabaul, both of which lasted from January to February 1942. Now, the army in Timor, on the other hand, fought for an entire year from February 1942 to February 1943 before they were finally defeated. The Japanese treated their prisoners very brutally, with 75% of the survivors of the Battle of Ambon, not including the 300 who had been executed during the Laha massacre, died due to ill treatment and poor jail conditions. In 1943, 2,815 Australians died during the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, and the next year 2,000 were forced into the Sandakan Death March, of whom only 6 survived. In May 1942, Japan even sent submarines to sink the HMAS Kutabul in Sydney and then bombarded it on June 8th. Between July and November, Australians stopped the Japanese attempt to attack Port Moresby and defeated them during the Battle of Milne Bay between August 25th and September 7th, the first time the Allies defeated the Japanese army. During the Battle of Bunagona, between November 16th, 1942 and January 22nd, 1943, Australian and American soldiers attacked Japanese positions at Buna, Sanandana, and Gona. On October 9th, 1942, the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1942 was passed, which finally made Australia independent, and it adopted the same statute which had allowed British dominions such as Canada to become independent in 1931. Now, by the end of the war in 1945, the first one which Australia had fought as an independent country, 1 million of the 7 million Australians were in the military, with 727,000 in the army, 216,900 in the Air Force, and 48,900 in the Navy, of whom 39,700 died. So, as we can see, Australia clearly participated in a major way, even if overall they might not have done as much. Now, having realized that they were at the mercy of Japan, Australia under Prime Minister Ben Chifley encouraged immigration in order to have a larger population to fight the next war. And over the next 2 decades, 2 million Europeans arrived in Australia. During the 4 decades after the war, 4.2 million immigrants arrived, of whom 40% were British and Irish. Although Australia wanted most of these immigrants to be British, they allowed other Europeans in order to meet their targets, with many Greek, Italian, Maltese, German, Yugoslav, and Dutch immigrants arriving. In 1949, Australia obtained the Ashmore and Cartier Islands from the United Kingdom. In 1950, it joined the United Nations coalition to fight North Korea during the Korean War. 17,000 soldiers, of whom only 339 were killed. That year, Australia also fought in the Malayan emergency against the Malaysian National Liberation Army, in a communist rebellion in British Malaya. Now, the Korean War ended in 1953 as a stalemate, and the Malayan emergency ended 7 years later, after a decade of war, with Australia winning and the Malaysian National Liberation Army being defeated. In 1954, the Queen of Australia visited the country for the first time. By the way, that's Queen Elizabeth II, who is also the Queen of the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and many other countries. Now, 5 years later, Australia reached a population of 10 million people, which, to be honest, is pretty small considering its size. But just remember, it's mostly desert. In 1963, Australia fought in the Borneo confrontation between, obviously, itself, Malaysia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand against Indonesia, which lasted until 1966, when Indonesia accepted the formation of Malaysia. And also that year, Prime Minister Harold Holt introduced the Migration Act 1966 that ended the White Australia policy and allowed non-European immigration. Next year allowed Aboriginal Australians to be counted in the census, which, is kind of normal since they're the original people there. However, he died that year when he just swam at the beach and just disappeared. Like, I'm not even kidding. This guy just swam and never came back. In 1968, Australia granted Nauru independence. And in 1965, it joined the Vietnam War, which, although was initially popular, conscription and the realization that they wouldn't win caused support for the war to decline. Australia participated in the Battle of Long Tan. No, not that kind of tanning. No, this kind of tanning. On August 18th, 1966, and defended against the Viet Cong's Tet Offensive between January and September 1968. Protests began in 1969, and the following year, soldiers started to be withdrawn until Australia lost and surrendered in 1973 after 521 deaths. In 1971, Neville Bonner became the first Aboriginal in the Parliament, and 5 years later, Sir Douglas Nicholls became the first Aboriginal to becoming governor of South Australia. In 1974, women were given the same pay as men, and the last territorial change occurred in 1975 when Papua New Guinea became independent. So this brings us finally to the more recent years. So in 1990, Australia joined the Gulf War against Iraq to defend Kuwait's independence, and in 2001 it joined the war in Afghanistan to overthrow the Afghan government and then fight the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. 2 years later it joined the Iraq War to overthrow the Iraqi government and then fight rebel terrorists such as the Supreme Command for Jihad and Liberation, the Naqshbandi Army, Al-Qaeda, Ansar al-Islam, the Islamic Army in Iraq, the peace companies, the Badr Organization, and Kataib Hezbollah. It withdrew in 2009 after inconclusive results. 2006, it helped East Timor in Operation Astute to fight the Timor-Leste defense forces that were rebelling and defeated them in 2013. The last war that Australia joined, and the only one that is still fighting apart from the one in Afghanistan, is the war on ISIS against ISIS and Al-Qaeda that began in 2014. Alright guys, that's it. We're done with the history of Australia, and after this I'll be making some announcements about how my channel will change and also just some important notification stuff you should know about. Don't forget to like and subscribe.